Imagine a world where your identity, your very existence in the eyes of the law, vanished the moment you said, "I do." Time when the land your family had worked for generations could never truly be yours, simply because you were born a girl. What if your voice in a courtroom was barely a whisper, easily silenced by the shouts of men? Welcome to 1225. Number 5. Limited economic autonomy and occupational choices. In the year of our Lord 1225, the world hummed with the daily grind of medieval life. The sun rose and set over fields tended by diligent hands, over bustling market towns, and over the imposing stone walls of castles and cathedrals. For many, life was a constant dance with survival, a delicate balance of planting, harvesting, trading, and praying. Women, of course, were an indispensable part of this intricate dance. They worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, their contributions vital to the household economy and the broader society. Yet, when it came to their ability to control their own economic destinies, to truly carve out a financial path independent of men, the legal landscape of 1225 presented formidable, often insurmountable, barriers. This was not a world where a woman could simply decide to open a shop, manage her own inheritance, or strike a deal in the marketplace without the overshadowing presence of a husband, a father, or a male guardian. The law, as it stood, largely channeled women's economic activities through male figures, severely limiting their autonomy and leaving them vulnerable in myriad ways. Consider the life of a woman like Elara, a skilled weaver living in a small village in England. Elara possessed a talent for transforming raw wool into beautiful, durable cloth, a craft she had learned from her mother and grandmother. Her hands moved with practiced grace, her mind buzzing with patterns and dyes. She could produce cloth of a quality that fetched good prices in the market, cloth that might even adorn the gentry. One would think that such skill and industry would lead to independence, to a direct control over her earnings, but the legal realities of 1225 painted a very different picture. Elara was unmarried, perhaps a widow or a maiden still living in her father's house. She might have a semblance of economic freedom. She could sell her cloth, negotiate prices, and keep the coin for herself, perhaps even making small investments. However, even then, her ability to enter into larger contracts, to borrow significant sums, or to engage in more complex business dealings might be curtailed by the need for a male guarantor or the general societal distrust of women acting without male oversight. A merchant looking to purchase a large quantity of her cloth might prefer to deal with a man, seeing a woman as less reliable or less legally binding in a serious transaction. True legal straitjacket, however, descended upon Elara the moment she spoke her vows at the church door. Upon marriage, Elara's legal identity, in many crucial aspects, merged with that of her husband. This concept, known as coverture, was a fundamental pillar of common law during this period. It meant that in the eyes of the law, Elara and her husband were considered one person, and that one person was the husband. This was not merely a symbolic union. It had profound and far-reaching legal consequences for her economic autonomy. Any property Elara owned before marriage, whether it was land, goods, or even money, legally passed into her husband's control. He could manage it, use it, sell it, or lease it as he saw fit, often without her consent or even her knowledge. If Elara inherited a small plot of land from a deceased relative after she was married, that land immediately became her husband's to administer and profit from during their marriage. She held no separate legal title to it, even if it had been in her family for generations. Furthermore, any income Elara generated through her weaving after her marriage was, by law, her husband's property. If she sold a length of fine wool cloth at the market, the coin she received was not legally hers to spend as she pleased. It belonged to her husband. He had the right to demand it, to use it for his own purposes, and to make decisions about how the household's income, including her earnings, was allocated. This meant that even if Elara was the primary breadwinner in the family, or if her weaving brought in significantly more income than her husband's labor, she had no legal standing to demand control over those funds. She could not, for instance, save money secretly for her own future, or invest it in a new loom without her husband's explicit permission, which he was under no legal obligation to grant. This legal framework meant that a woman's economic contribution, however significant, was often rendered invisible or subsumed within the male-headed household economy. Her labor was expected, her skill appreciated, but her right to control the fruits of that labor was almost entirely absent. Constraints extended beyond personal earnings to broader occupational choices. While women were indeed integral to many aspects of the medieval economy, their participation was often limited to specific roles deemed appropriate for their gender, or was restricted by burgeoning professional organizations. For instance, in many towns, guilds were becoming increasingly powerful, regulating trades and crafts. These guilds often excluded women from full membership, particularly in the more lucrative or specialized professions. While a woman might work alongside her husband in his craft, perhaps assisting him in his smithy or his tanning business, she would rarely be granted full master status within the guild herself. This meant she could not open her own independent shop, hire apprentices, or vote on guild matters, even if she possessed superior skill. A widow might, for a time, be allowed to continue her deceased husband's trade, but this was often seen as a temporary measure to protect her family, not a recognition of her inherent right or ability to practice the trade independently. Such permissions were often contingent on her remaining unmarried or on the approval of the guild masters, who were almost universally men. Consider the restrictions faced by women who might have aspired to more complex commercial endeavor. A woman wishing to engage in large-scale trade, perhaps buying and selling goods across different towns, would face immense legal and social hurdles. She would struggle to secure credit, as her property and earnings were not her own to pledge as collateral. She would find it difficult to negotiate contracts, as her legal capacity to bind herself in such agreements was limited. Even in the thriving markets and fairs, where women were active as vendors of produce, dairy, and simple crafts, their scale of operation was often constrained by these underlying legal disadvantages. A woman might sell eggs or cheese she produced, but she would rarely be a major merchant importing spices or exporting wool on a large scale, not because she lacked the intelligence or ambition, but because the legal system simply did not accommodate such independent female enterprise. Actions would often need to be conducted under the name and legal authority of a male relative. Even for women in urban centers who might have sought to establish themselves in independent businesses, such as ale selling or small-scale retail, the legal environment presented a constant challenge. While many alewives, for example, were indeed women, their legal position was precarious. Their profits, if they were married, belonged to their husbands. Their ability to acquire property for their business, or to enter into leases for their premises, was often contingent on their husband's consent and involvement. If a husband was irresponsible or simply chose to interfere, he could effectively dismantle his wife's business venture with little to no legal recourse available to her. Historians poring over ancient court rolls and municipal records have found numerous instances where women's attempts at independent economic activity were thwarted or exploited due to these legal limitations. They might be unable to reclaim debts owed to them, as only their husbands could legally pursue such claims, or their own debts might be considered their husband's responsibility, leading to complicated legal disputes. The world of 1225 also saw the beginnings of professionalization in areas like medicine and law, areas from which women were almost entirely excluded by legal custom and emerging regulations. While women often served as healers and midwives within their communities, their practice was largely informal and often outside any regulated professional structure. They could not attend universities, which were exclusively male institutions, and thus could not acquire the formal education or credentials that were beginning to define recognized professions. Similarly, the legal profession itself, from attorneys to judges, was an entirely male domain. A woman could not represent herself in court if she was married, nor could she represent others. Her voice, her arguments, had to be channeled through a male advocate, often her husband or a male relative. This meant that women were not only legally restricted in their economic actions, but also denied the opportunity to develop and apply their intellect in fields that were increasingly central to societal structure and economic power. The impact of these legal disadvantages was not merely theoretical. It shaped the daily lives and long-term prospects of countless women. For a married woman, financial independence was a distant dream, replaced by a deep reliance on her husband's goodwill and competence. If he was a prudent manager, her life might be comfortable. But if he was profligate, abusive, or simply inept, she had very little legal recourse to protect her own economic interests or those of her children. Her dower rights, which allowed her a portion of her husband's land or property upon his death, were often the only legal mechanism to ensure some economic security in widowhood, but even these were sometimes contested or difficult to enforce. And during her marriage, her economic contributions, no matter how substantial, were legally invisible, a silent testament to a system that valued her labor but denied her control over its fruits. This legal landscape ensured that while women were indispensable to the economy, they were largely disempowered within it, their economic lives legally tethered to the men who governed. Number 4. Vulnerability to violence and limited legal recourse. Imagine walking through a medieval village or town in 1225, knowing that if harm befell you, if violence touched your life, the very laws designed to protect might offer you little solace, or even actively hinder your pursuit of justice. For women in 1225, this was often the stark reality. The legal framework of the High Middle Ages, while ostensibly designed to maintain order and dispense justice, frequently fell short when it came to protecting women from violence, particularly within the confines of their own homes or when the perpetrator was a man of power. Their access to legal recourse was often limited, their testimony less valued, and the societal attitudes towards women's bodies and roles made them uniquely vulnerable to various forms of abuse with inadequate avenues for redress. This was a world where a woman's cry for justice could easily be swallowed by the silent indifference of a system built by men, for men. Consider the pervasive issue of domestic violence, a shadow that often fell silently within the walls of homes, from the simplest cottage to the grandest manor. 1225, the legal and social norms largely granted husbands significant authority over their wives, viewing the wife as subject to her husband's discipline. While extreme brutality that led to death or severe maiming might be prosecuted, ordinary physical chastisement was often considered within the husband's prerogative. The legal texts of the time, often reflecting common custom, did not explicitly forbid a husband from striking his wife. Instead, the law largely considered such matters to be private affairs, not suitable for public intervention unless they escalated to an extreme and visible level that disrupted public peace. A wife who suffered beatings, even regular ones, had very few, if any, legal channels through which to seek protection or punishment for her husband. She could not easily sue him for assault, as her legal identity was subsumed by his. Property, if any, was under his control, meaning she had no independent means to pay for legal representation, even if such representation were an option for a woman. If a wife were to flee her home due to abuse, she risked being seen as deserting her husband, a serious offense in a society that valued marital stability and the husband's authority. She might find no refuge with her own family, who might either be unwilling to interfere in a marital dispute or unable to protect her from her husband's claims over her. The only realistic path to escape persistent abuse might be to seek sanctuary in a church, but even then, the church's intervention would usually focus on reconciliation, urging the husband to mend his ways and the wife to return to her duties, rather than offering her a permanent separation or legal protection from her abuser. The law offered no restraining orders, no quick divorces for abuse, and no specific protections that empowered a woman to escape such a grim reality. Her well-being was often left to the mercy of her husband's temperament and the informal interventions of family or community, which were not legally binding or consistently applied. Moving beyond the home, crimes of sexual violence presented another fraught landscape for women seeking justice. While rape was considered a serious crime, punishable by severe penalties, including blinding, castration, or even death, the legal process itself was fraught with challenges for the victim. The burden of proof was incredibly high, and the woman's testimony alone was often deemed insufficient, particularly if there were no witnesses or obvious physical injuries. A woman accusing a man of rape had to immediately raise the hue and cry, meaning she had to loudly and publicly declare the assault as soon as it happened and show signs of her distress and injury to neighbors or officials. Any delay or apparent lack of visible struggle could be used to discredit her accusation. Furthermore, her reputation and chastity were frequently put on trial alongside the accused. If she was not considered a chaste woman, or if she had any prior sexual history, her credibility could be undermined, and her accusation dismissed as consensual sex or even slander. Consider the journey of a woman named Elara, who was assaulted while traveling from one village to another. When she finally reached safety and reported the crime, she would face an arduous legal path. Testimony would be scrutinized, her account cross-examined not only for consistency, but also for any hint of impropriety on her part. She might be questioned about her attire, her whereabouts, her prior interactions with the accused, all designed to shift blame onto her. The accused was a powerful man, perhaps a local lord or a wealthy merchant. Eliana's chances of obtaining justice would diminish even further. Such men often had the resources to employ skilled advocates, to bribe officials, or to pressure witnesses. The very system of justice, dependent on male jurors and judges, might be biased against a woman of lower social standing, accusing a man of higher status. Many cases of sexual violence therefore went unreported, or were quietly settled out of court through agreements that offered little justice to the victim, but spared the accused the public humiliation and legal consequences. The legal system also treated abduction and forced marriage as crimes, but again, the victim's recourse was limited. If a woman of property or status was abducted for the purpose of forced marriage, often to gain control over her lands or inheritance, her family could pursue legal action against the abductor. However, this legal action was often focused on the violation of the family's proprietary rights over the woman, rather than solely on the woman's bodily autonomy or psychological trauma. The woman herself, if she was married, could not initiate the legal proceedings. Her male relatives had to do so. Furthermore, if she was forcibly married, it was often difficult to have the marriage annulled, especially if it had been consummated. The church, while condemning forced marriages, often prioritized the sanctity of the marital bond once established, making annulment a complex and difficult process, often requiring proof of absolute duress from the very moment of the vows. A woman who had been coerced into marriage might find herself legally bound for life, with little hope of escape, even if her life was miserable and unsafe. Even beyond specific crimes of violence, a woman's testimony in court was often treated with suspicion or given less weight than that of a man. Cases where a woman was a witness to a crime, her account might be corroborated by other, male witnesses or discounted entirely if it stood alone. This inherent bias stemmed from deeply ingrained beliefs about women's nature, that they were more emotional, less rational, and thus less reliable as witnesses. This meant that even when women were direct victims of or witnesses to crimes, their ability to seek justice through the legal system was significantly hampered by their perceived lack of credibility. This was not a stated legal rule in all instances, but a pervasive societal attitude that permeated judicial proceedings and influenced how evidence was weighed by male judges and jurors. Furthermore, access to the legal system itself was often an insurmountable hurdle for women. Legal education and practice were exclusively male domains. Women could not serve as judges, jurors, or attorneys. If a woman needed to pursue a legal claim, she had to rely on a male advocate, her husband, her father, or a hired male lawyer. This reliance meant that her case was filtered through a male perspective, and her interests might not be fully or accurately represented, especially if her interests diverged from those of her male advocate. For a married woman, her legal capacity was almost entirely subsumed by her husband. She could not initiate lawsuits on her own behalf in most circumstances. Even if she was a widow or a single woman who theoretically had more legal autonomy, the process was daunting, expensive, and often required navigating a system populated entirely by men who might not prioritize her concerns. In essence, for women in 1225, the path to justice in cases of violence was treacherous and often unwinnable. Whether it was the quiet suffering within the home, the public humiliation of a rape trial, or the forced loss of autonomy through abduction, the legal system offered meager protections and placed immense burdens on the victim. Prevailing legal principles, societal attitudes, and the very structure of the legal profession conspired to leave women profoundly vulnerable, their calls for justice often unheard or deliberately ignored, painting a stark picture of a world where women's safety and bodily integrity were often secondary to male authority and privilege. Number 3, lack of political and public office participation. Imagine a world where your voice, no matter how intelligent or insightful, could never be heard in the halls of power, where your ideas, no matter how brilliant, could never shape the laws of the land, and where your leadership, no matter how capable, could never steer the ship of state or church. For women in 1225, this imagined world was their daily reality. The legal and customary landscape of the High Middle Ages firmly excluded women from almost all positions of political authority, public office, and formal governance. Their influence, if it existed, was relegated to informal channels, personal persuasion, or the rare exception of a powerful dowager operating through her male relatives. The very notion of a woman holding a public office, serving on a jury, or participating in the decision-making bodies that govern society was simply not part of the established legal order or the prevailing worldview. Let us consider the grand tapestry of governance in 1225, from the highest levels of the monarchy down to the smallest village courts. At the apex stood the king, surrounded by his male barons, bishops, and councillors. The Great Council, which would eventually evolve into parliament, was exclusively male. Women could not be elected or appointed to such deliberative bodies. They could not serve as royal advisors, even if they were queens, their influence often indirect, through their relationships with male family members. The queen might wield considerable informal power, particularly if she acted as a regent for a young son, but her authority was derived from her male child's legal right to rule, not from her own inherent right to govern. Once her son came of age, her regency ended, and her direct political authority ceased. She could advise, she could plot, she could negotiate, but she could not legally occupy the throne in her own right if there was a male heir, nor could she openly legislate or command. Below the royal court, the feudal system also largely excluded women from holding formal political power. While women of noble birth might inherit lordships, they typically exercised their authority through male proxies, such as a husband or a steward. A noblewoman might oversee the administration of her estates, managing finances and tenants, but her legal position as a feudal lord was often contingent on her marital status. If she was unmarried, she would often be placed under the guardianship of a male relative or the king himself, who would control her marriage and her lands. If she married, her husband assumed control of her estates, administering them in her name, but with his own legal authority. She could not personally sit in a feudal court to administer justice, nor could she lead troops in battle or participate in the rituals of homage and fealty that defined feudal political relationships, roles reserved exclusively for men. The burgeoning system of common law and local administration also presented an impenetrable barrier to female participation. Sheriffs who enforced royal justice and managed shires were always men. Justices of the peace, who presided over local courts, were men. Juries, both grand juries, which decided whether to bring charges, and petty juries, which decided guilt or innocence, were exclusively male. The very idea of a woman serving on a jury, judging the actions of her peers, was alien to the legal thought of the time. This meant that legal disputes involving women, even those profoundly affecting their lives, were decided by all male panels, potentially introducing biases based on gendered assumptions or societal expectations. A woman could not be a witness in all cases, or her testimony was often given less weight, as discussed earlier. The role of an active participant in the machinery of justice, whether as a judge, a juror, or a legal official, was entirely closed off to her. Consider the life of a village or a town. The reeve who oversaw the daily workings of the manor was always a man. Bailiff who collected rents and managed the lord's lands was a man. Burgesses and aldermen who governed the growing towns, regulating trade, maintaining order, and collecting taxes, were exclusively male. Women could not hold these offices. They could not vote in town assemblies or participate in their decisions, even if they owned property and contributed to the town's economy. Contributions, however significant, were seen as economic and social, but not political. The concept of citizenship, with its attendant rights and responsibilities in the public sphere, was almost entirely gendered, applying primarily to men. This exclusion meant that women had no formal avenue to shape local ordinances, to advocate for their own interests through direct representation, or to participate in the civic life of their communities beyond the domestic sphere. The church, a dominant force in medieval society, also presented a formidable barrier to female participation in positions of authority. While women could become nuns and lead convents as abbesses, even these roles were often subject to male ecclesiastical authority, particularly bishops and abbots. Abbesses, while powerful within their own cloisters, could not sit in church councils, become bishops, or hold any of the higher offices within the ecclesiastical hierarchy that wielded immense spiritual and temporal power. Priesthood was exclusively male, as was the path to becoming a cardinal or the pope. This meant that women were systematically excluded from shaping church doctrine, from administering sacraments beyond very limited roles, and from wielding the profound spiritual and moral authority that came with ordained office. Piety was celebrated, their charitable work encouraged, but their leadership in the formal structures of the church was legally and doctrinally impossible. Even roles that might seem to involve public service, such as town crier, scribe, or official messenger, were overwhelmingly male-dominated. While women might perform certain laboring roles, such as tending to public markets or assisting in town cleanup, they were not entrusted with roles that involved official communication, legal record-keeping, or the exercise of public authority. The assumption was that such roles required the gravitas, rationality, and legal capacity that women were widely believed to lack. This exclusion from public administration meant that women's perspectives were absent from the very institutions that ordered daily life, from setting market prices to determining punishments for crimes. The legal disadvantages surrounding political and public office participation were not merely theoretical. They had profound implications for how women's lives were governed and how their rights were upheld. Without a direct voice in lawmaking bodies, without the ability to serve in the courts, and without access to administrative power, women's interests could easily be overlooked or subjugated. Laws were crafted by men who might not fully understand or prioritize the specific needs and challenges faced by women. Judicial decisions were made by men who might harbor unconscious biases or subscribe to prevailing stereotypes about female behavior and capabilities. The absence of women from these spheres meant that the legal system and the governance structures were overwhelmingly masculine in their perspective, their priorities, and their application. In essence, the legal landscape of 1225 placed an iron curtain between women and the public exercise of power. From the crown to the lowest court, from the battlefield to the bishopric, the formal levers of governance were firmly in the hands of men. Women might exert influence through marriage, through family connections, or through informal social networks, but their ability to directly participate in the creation, interpretation, or enforcement of laws was virtually non-existent. This systemic exclusion meant that while women were indispensable to the functioning of medieval society, they were legally rendered invisible in the political arena, their voices silenced in the very forums where decisions shaping their lives were made. Number 2, inheritance rights, especially for land. Imagine dreaming of inheriting the ancient family farm, the land your ancestors tilled for generations, the very soil that nourished your family's history. Then a grim reality dawns. Because you are a daughter, not a son, that dream will likely remain just that, a dream. In 1225, for women, navigating the complex world of inheritance, particularly concerning land, was one of the most profound legal disadvantages. The system of inheritance, deeply rooted in feudal custom and common law, overwhelmingly favored male heirs, ensuring that property, especially valuable land, largely remained within the male line. While there were specific, limited avenues for women to inherit, these were often exceptions to the general rule and rarely granted them the same control or enduring rights as their male counterparts. This was a legal framework designed to preserve property and power through male succession, often at the direct expense of a woman's birthright. Cornerstone of inheritance law for land in 1225, particularly in England, was the principle of primogeniture. This meant that when a landowner died, his eldest legitimate son was the primary heir to all his lands and titles, inheriting them intact. If there were no sons, then the inheritance would pass to the daughters, but usually with a significant caveat. Instead of one daughter inheriting everything, the land would often be divided equally among all daughters as co-heiresses. This division, known as parceners, meant that each daughter received only a fragmented portion of the estate, weakening its overall economic and political power. If a single daughter inherited, she would still face limitations compared to a son, as her legal rights to the land would be significantly altered upon marriage, as we will explore further. This system effectively prioritized the perpetuation of male-headed households and military service, which was the bedrock of feudal society. Consider the family of Lord Thomas, who had 3 daughters but no sons. Upon his death, his daughters Elara, Isabella, and Catherine would theoretically inherit his lands. However, instead of one of them stepping into their father's shoes as the sole lord of the manor, the estate would be divided into 3 parts. Each sister would then hold a fragmented share. This fragmentation made the land less valuable as a single unit, and complicated its management. Furthermore, each sister's portion would immediately become subject to the control of her husband upon marriage. If Elara married, her husband would gain control of her inherited land for the duration of their marriage, managing its revenues and making decisions about its use. Elara would retain theoretical, seasoned possession, but no practical control. This meant that even if a woman was the sole surviving heir in a family, her inheritance was not truly hers. In the same way, it would be for a male heir who retained full control and could pass it directly to his own sons. The most common form of inheritance for daughters was not land itself, but a dowry or marriage portion. This was a payment or gift, often of money or movable goods, provided by the bride's family to the groom upon marriage. Dowry was intended to help establish the new household and acted as a form of pre-mortem inheritance for the daughter, a way to provide for her without fragmenting the family's main landed estate. While a dowry offered a woman some economic security, it was not the same as inheriting direct control over land. Dowry usually became the husband's property upon marriage, further limiting the woman's economic autonomy. This practice reinforced the idea that a woman's primary economic value was tied to her role as a wife and mother, rather than as an independent landowner or head of household. The rights of widows were also legally constrained. Upon her husband's death, a widow typically had a right to dower, which was a life interest in 1/3 of her husband's lands. This meant she could use and profit from that portion of land for the remainder of her life, but she did not own it outright and could not pass it on to her own heirs. Upon her death, the dower land reverted to her husband's rightful heirs, usually his eldest son. While dower provided a crucial source of income and shelter for many widows, it was a limited right, designed to support her rather than grant her full proprietary control. Furthermore, securing her dower rights could be a challenging legal battle, particularly if her husband's male heirs wished to deny her claim or if the family's finances were precarious. She might have to sue in court to claim her dower, a difficult and expensive process for a woman with limited legal standing. Even when specific forms of land tenure or local custom allowed for different inheritance patterns, such as Borough English, where the youngest son inherited, or Gavelkind, where all sons inherited equally, these still predominantly favored male heirs. Any exceptions for daughters or women were usually based on the absence of male heirs, not on a principle of gender equality in inheritance. These deviations from primogeniture were often confined to specific regions or manors, and they did not negate the overarching legal bias against female land ownership and control. Consider the intricate world of feudal tenures. Land was not simply owned in the modern sense, it was held in complex relationships of fealty and service. Many tenures involved military service or homage to an overlord, roles that were inherently masculine. A woman, by custom and law, could not perform military service. This meant that if a woman inherited a feudal holding, she would have to provide a male proxy or pay a fee, a relief, to her overlord to avoid military duties, further complicating her position and potentially diminishing the value of her inheritance. The very structure of feudal society, built upon the bedrock of military service and loyalty oaths from male vassals, made it challenging to integrate women as full and independent landholders within its rigid framework. Furthermore, legal instruments like entails, which dictated how land would be inherited through generations, were often used to ensure land passed only through the male line. Father wishing to preserve his family's estates and titles would often entail his land to his heirs male of his body, meaning only his sons, grandsons, and so forth could inherit. This legal mechanism specifically excluded daughters, even if they were the only surviving direct descendants, forcing the inheritance to pass to more distant male relatives rather than break the male line. This was a powerful tool used by landholding families to prevent their estates from being fragmented by female inheritance or from being absorbed into another family through marriage. Profound legal disadvantage in inheritance meant that women, even those from wealthy or noble families, were often economically dependent on their male relatives, their fathers, brothers, husbands, or sons. Their future financial security was rarely in their own hands, but rather contingent on the decisions and fortunes of the men in their lives. This dependency extended beyond mere economics. It affected their status, their marriage prospects, and their overall standing in society. A woman with no significant inheritance and no powerful male protectors, faced a much more precarious existence. The legal system, in its design, deliberately created and reinforced this economic and social hierarchy, placing women firmly in a position of reliance rather than independent control over landed wealth. Number 1. Legal status as dependent on men. Coverture. Imagine a world where the very moment you say, "I do," your identity, your legal existence, simply dissolves. Where, in the eyes of the law, you cease to be an independent person, capable of making your own decisions, owning your own property, or speaking for yourself in public. This was the stark, pervasive reality for married women in 1225 under the principle known as coverture, a cornerstone of English common law during the High Middle Ages. More than any other single legal disadvantage, coverture fundamentally stripped married women of their independent legal identity, subsuming it entirely within that of their husbands. It meant that a woman's legal rights, her capacity to act, and her very standing in the legal system were largely, if not entirely, controlled by her husband, rendering her, in practical terms, a perpetual legal minor. Let's delve into the profound implications of coverture. The legal theory behind it was that upon marriage, husband and wife became one flesh in the eyes of God, and crucially, one person in the eyes of the law. That one person, however, was the husband. This was not a partnership of equals, but a hierarchical arrangement where the husband was the head of the legal entity. For a woman, this meant an immediate and dramatic loss of almost all independent legal rights and capacities she might have possessed as a single woman or a widow. First and foremost, a married woman could not own property independently of her husband. Any land, goods, or money she possessed before marriage or acquired during marriage legally passed into her husband's control. Elara, our weaver from earlier, owned a small cottage and a plot of land before she married. These assets would immediately become her husband's to manage, lease, or even sell, all without her consent. She held no separate title, no independent claim. If her husband chose to mortgage her inherited land, she had no legal power to stop him. He decided to sell a valuable piece of jewelry she brought into the marriage. He had the legal right to do so. This complete transfer of property rights meant that a married woman had no independent economic base, making her entirely dependent on her husband's goodwill and financial management. Only guaranteed right to property usually came upon his death, in the form of dower, a limited life interest in a portion of his land, which was often only secured through legal struggle. Beyond property, coverture severely curtailed a married woman's ability to enter into contracts. She could not sign agreements, incur debts, or make purchases of significant value without her husband's explicit permission or involvement. If she borrowed money, the debt was legally her husband's. If she tried to sell something without his consent, the transaction might be deemed invalid. This meant that any independent economic activity she engaged in, such as selling her woven cloth, was legally considered her husband's business, and the profits belonged to him. This created an immense barrier to independent enterprise and left women vulnerable. Imagine a situation where a woman, through her skill, had built up a small trade. Upon marriage, her entire operation, her earnings, and her future ability to trade were subject to her husband's approval, potentially stifling her ambition, or even leading to the collapse of her livelihood if he was unsupportive or irresponsible. Perhaps one of the most debilitating aspects of coverture was its impact on a woman's legal standing in court. A married woman could not sue or be sued in her own name. If she wished to bring a legal complaint, say, to reclaim a debt owed to her or to seek justice for an injury, she had to do so jointly with her husband. Her husband had to be the named plaintiff alongside her. If she was the one being sued, perhaps for a debt or an alleged wrong, her husband had to be named as the defendant alongside her. This meant that her access to justice was entirely mediated through her husband. If he refused to join her in a lawsuit, or if he actively opposed her interests, she was left without legal recourse. Her voice in the courtroom was not her own. It was channeled, or often silenced, by her husband's legal authority. This also meant that a husband was often held responsible for his wife's actions, even those committed before marriage, further entangling her legal fate with his. The concept of a married woman being a feme covert, a covered woman, essentially rendered her a non-entity in most public legal matters. She could not serve as an executor of a will without her husband's consent, nor could she act as a guardian for her own children if her husband was alive, as he was considered the children's legal guardian. her person, too, was legally linked to her husband's. He was considered responsible for her actions, and conversely, he had the right to her companionship and labor. This legal framework meant that a wife effectively lost much of her personal autonomy, her decisions and actions legally viewed as extensions of her husband's will. Even the laws concerning marriage itself reinforced this power imbalance. While divorce was almost impossible in 1225, typically requiring an annulment from the church on very narrow grounds, a woman's right to separate or leave an abusive husband was virtually non-existent without significant social and economic risk. Her legal identity was so intertwined with her husband's that walking away meant abandoning her legal status, her property if any, and potentially her children, leaving her destitute and without legal protection. The law provided no mechanisms for a wife to independently protect herself from her husband's mismanagement of her former property, his debts, or his abuses, beyond extreme, life-threatening scenarios that might draw informal community intervention. The only women who retained significant legal autonomy were single women who had never married femme sole, or widows who had outlived their husbands. Femme sole could own property, enter into contracts, and sue or be sued in her own name. A widow, having emerged from coverture, regained many of these rights, though she might still face limitations related to dower and inheritance. However, the expectation for almost all women in medieval society was to marry, meaning that the vast majority would eventually fall under the legal dominion of coverture, losing their independent legal standing for the duration of their marriage. This created a stark contrast in legal rights between single and married women, heavily incentivizing marriage while simultaneously imposing severe legal penalties on those who entered into it. The impact of coverture was not merely a matter of legal theory. It shaped the daily lives, opportunities, and vulnerabilities of countless women. It meant that a woman's financial security, her physical safety, and her ability to participate in the broader legal and economic spheres were almost entirely dependent on the character and actions of her husband. If he was kind, responsible, and just, her life might be tolerable. But if he was abusive, negligent, or simply inept, she had very little legal recourse to protect herself or her interests. Her very voice in the legal system was silenced, her property transferred, and her autonomy surrendered, making coverture the most fundamental and far-reaching legal disadvantage for women in 1225, painting a clear picture of a legal system that saw women primarily as adjuncts to their male relatives, not as independent legal persons.